I call this stream of consciousness review because I'm thinking about the midterm exam, and this is the main material that I think you could use a little bit of review on. It's not particularly comprehensive. This is not all the material that's on the exam. All the material on the exam is in the textbook. This is a list of headings that would be helpful, I think, to review because maybe it is some of the more obscure knowledge. I start out with the fact that Homer is an amalgam of different ages. That means he's a combination of different periods in Greek history. Which of the ages are represented in the Homeric poems? You have the Late Bronze Age. You should know the dates for that. You have the Dark Age, and you have the Archaic Age. That's the main thing that you need to know in regard to Homer. It's not really a realistic poem about the Bronze Age. It's not really a realistic poem about the Dark Age or the Archaic Age. It's a fictional world created that includes all three of those ages. The person that went out and discovered Troy was Heinrich Schliemann. You should know about him, have an idea about his dates. The person that went out and looked at Minoan archaeology is Arthur Evans. Schliemann ended up doing Mycenaean. Evans ended up doing Minoan. But Evans comes after Schliemann. However, the civilizations that they studied, the Minoan came first. Even though Evans himself was an archaeologist later than Schliemann, the society that he studied came first in history, and the Mycenaeans came second. So the civilizations that they studied are in reverse order. The palace economy is the kind of economy that was used in both the Mycenaean world and the Minoan world. It's based on a Near East model. It's a centralized economy where they collect taxes, in this case mostly food, and they can redistribute it or trade it. That's called a palace economy in both the Minoan civilization and the Mycenaean civilization. The Mycenaeans are primarily functioning or hitting their rise in the Late Bronze Age, and the Minoans are in the Middle Bronze Age. Now let's clear that up for a minute here. So you can look at these topics. You should know things about Schliemann. You should know things about Evans. You should know what the palace economy is. The Schliemann civilization, again, is the Late Bronze Age Mycenaeans, whereas Evans's society is the Middle Bronze Age, which comes first, Minoan society on the island of Crete. The Cyclopean walls, is that associated with the Minoans or the Mycenaeans? That's associated with the Minoans. Just kidding, it's associated with the Mycenaeans. Stream of consciousness review, I call this. It's just coming out as it comes out, but it should be a good review for you. The Cyclopean walls are associated with the Mycenaean civilization, which Schliemann discovers and does the archaeology for in the early days. That's in the Late Bronze Age of the society that probably is responsible for the war at Troy. The little notes that I'm saying on the side are the kind of things that you should be looking up and familiarizing yourself with. What these two early pioneers of archaeology did could be called material culture. Again, that term's in the textbook. We used it in the first day of class, but it's probably a pretty obscure term right now. That's just another term for archaeology. It's the term for what the archaeologists study. They're studying the things that you can physically touch. Sometimes the things that they can physically touch would be writings. Those inscriptions would also be part of the material culture. The text of the Iliad, when you're reading just the literature itself, that's mostly not the material culture unless you can find a physical piece of ancient papyrus on which it's written. The study of the writing, for example, the actual text that you can find and touch from the ancient world, like most of our texts of the Iliad are not from the ancient world, they're from the Middle Ages. But the study of the early physical texts that you can touch, because they're put on stone usually, is called epigraphy. Again, a relatively obscure term that's way back in the book, but these are the kind of things I'm trying to emphasize in case you missed them the first time. Now my stream of consciousness review, that brings me to F.A. Wolf, and he asks something called the Homeric question. He says, could one person have really written both the Iliad and the Odyssey? Those are the names of the Homeric texts. There's 13 songs, and these are songs, the Iliad and the Odyssey, in the epic cycle. Only 2 of them are fully extant. Extant means that they survive. The epic cycle has 13 songs in the epic cycle. Only the Iliad and Odyssey survive. Wolff says there's no way one person could have written the Iliad and Odyssey, and there's all kinds of strange inconsistencies within them. He comes up with what you call the Homeric question. And what the Homeric question asks is, could one person have written it? And the answer is eventually found by a guy called Milman Parry in 1928. He finds people in what was modern Yugoslavia at the time, that could recite poems that were 16 songs that were 16,000 lines long, and they were illiterate bards, and that's probably the same thing that was going on with Homer. If I'm going fast on this thing, the beautiful part about it is that you can pause it, rewind it, and the whole point, again, is not to reteach the class in 15 minutes, but to give you the topics that might be more obscure, that you might have forgotten, to link together some of the ideas quickly. The idea is not to reteach the class, but give you a quick overview. You have the quizzes to study from. You have each chapter has sections in the beginning of it that give you the dates, terms, and figures, and the quotations are throughout the text that you need to be prepared for on the exam. The lecture, in-class lectures, also had quotations that are relevant for the exam. All right, then you get to this guy Eratosthenes. Speaking of the chronology of everything, he's the guy who first measured the Earth accurately. He's living maybe around 200 BC in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, founded by Alexander the Great. That's beyond where we are at this point in the class. But it's still relevant to know. He's the one who has the best chronology in the ancient world, and we use those dates mostly. Like, for example, the date 1188 is basically his date for the fall of Troy. That's our date for the end of the late Bronze Age, when the Mycenaean civilization collapses. So we use Eratosthenes' dates, his chronology. There's also another thing called the Parian marble. Parian marble is another good source, a primary source of the term that you would use. That term's on the exam. I'm having a little trouble writing on the iPad here. The Parian marble is another good source that we use to find the primary sources and the best dates for what happened in antiquity. Parian marble didn't end up being written very well. I'll write it one more time, but again, that's something that's in the textbook. You've seen it before. Parian marble. I don't know why that word in particular is unwritable, but it is. Then we move on to the Athenian history. And you've got a man called Chilon. He's an Olympic victor who tries to overthrow Athens. He's caught by a member of the Alcmaeonid family. And he is killed even though he takes refuge in a temple. That's called the Chilon affair, and it makes the Alcmaeonidae, the children from this family line, the sons essentially of Alcmaeon, the bad guys in Athenian history. And they are kind of the bad guys in Athenian history. They're the family that controls Athens, but they're a cursed family. They don't completely control Athens, but they're very important. For example, the person who really is credited with the invention of democracy is Cleisthenes, and he's from the Alcmaeonid family. Some scholars have suggested that democracy is really just a plot to make the Alcmaeonidae even more powerful, to consolidate their power further. But that's not until 508 BC. It's getting a little bit ahead of where I want to be at this moment. Going back to Theseus. Theseus is this guy that is alive supposedly during the Middle Bronze Age with Minoans. Then he's alive for the Late Bronze Age because he's involved with the Trojan War. Really, he's a little bit before the Trojan War, but just one generation before. He kidnaps Helen, though, when she's just a young girl, the girl that causes Troy, the Trojan War. And then he must be alive in the Dark Age because then he's alive in the Archaic Age, which is when the Synoikism of Athens occurs. And the Synoikism is when the region of Athens is brought together under one rule. So Theseus is largely a legendary figure because he can't live for thousands of years or 1,000 years, but he's important in the history of Athens. That term Synoikism is one of those roots of that word oikos. And you see it in the word Synoikos. Sinoikis, you see that word in apoikia, which is the word for colony. That's on the exam. It means away from the household. Apo means away from. So there's a bunch of different words that you see from that root oikos, which means household. And the English word economics comes from that. Synoikism is when you bring a region together under one ruler. Apoikia is the name for a colony, for example. Speaking of the Trojan War, Nestor is the old man in the Odyssey and the Iliad. And you should know some of the main characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those lists are in that textbook, in the chapters in which you read selections from the Iliad and the Odyssey. If names like Agamemnon and Odysseus and Achilles and Penelope don't ring a bell for you, go back and look at the list of characters from the Iliad and the Odyssey. You should have the main names. Nestor is only one of many of the main characters. There's not an endless list of characters from the Iliad or the Odyssey that you need to know, but there are some. Moving on to the Dark Age, there's a major site, only one really, that you have to know for the Dark Age. It's called Lefkandi. There's a so-called heroine of Lefkandi there. Nobody even knows really what it is, but they call it a heroine. It means a place where you worship a hero. Maybe it's a grave, maybe it's the chieftain's house of that little town in the Dark Age, maybe it's a place of worship. Nobody knows. Archilochus is one of the lyric poets, and he's the first person we know to use the Greek alphabet in the Archaic Age. Now we're moving on to the Archaic Age when lyric poetry is started to be performed for the first time alongside of epic. Epic doesn't end. Epic cycles still perform. The Iliad and Odyssey are still popular. But Archilochus, we know, in 648 BC, he saw a particular eclipse. And that's a very particular date that we can give to him. And he's really the first person we know used the alphabet. Homer was an illiterate bard. Archilochus' works were written down at a certain point, and we know that he was alive in 648 BC. Herodotus is the first historian. He's operating in Athens. He's an Ionian Greek. All the Athenians essentially are Ionian Greeks, as opposed to the Spartans in the south and other Greeks in the south and the Peloponnesus who are Dorian Greeks. Herodotus writes his history around 425 BC. He's living in the classical age now. And he's the first person to use the word history. Thucydides is really the second major historian. There are some other people after Herodotus, but Thucydides is the most important one. He's, again, is an Athenian. Herodotus writes the story of the Persian invasions, Persian Wars, which are 490, and then again in 480 to 479, and 490 is the Battle of Marathon. But you have Thucydides not writing about the Persian invasion in 490 or 480 to 479, but Thucydides writes about the Peloponnesian War. That's the war that really kind of destroys the classical world, 431 to 404. That's between Athens and Sparta, and that's why I focus so much at a certain point on the rise of Athens and the rise of Sparta, because these two come into a long war that really ruins the classical age, destroys Greece. Thucydides is the author who writes the history of that, and he's actually a general. The Athenian term is he's a strategos in that war. But he's exiled. The Athenians have this part of their government when they invent the democracy, which is called being ostracized, and you can be voted out of the city of Athens, and he's actually one of the people who gets ostracized because he fails to complete his mission in the Peloponnesian War. And then I wanted to go over some quotations. Cicero on the first day of class, I said, to remain ignorant of what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. To remain ignorant of what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. And I think that's a great thematic quotation that sums up this whole class to this point. You don't want to be childlike. You don't want to have the mind of a child. You don't want to have the ignorance of a child. Children are great for a lot of ways, but you don't want to remain forever a child. And Cicero says this. He's assassinated in 44 BC, so far out of the range that we've studied so far, 44 BC. Sorry, Cicero is assassinated in 43 BC. Julius Caesar is assassinated in 44 BC. excuse the casualness of this little screencast here. It's meant to be quick. Then I give you these 7 wise men of Greece in 2 different chapters. They're from the Archaic Age. Thales of Miletus gives the most important one. Know yourself. You continue with Solon of Athens, the great lawgiver of Athens in the Archaic Age. He was probably a tyrant. There's an important word from the Archaic Age. All of these guys, these 7 wise men, were probably tyrants, but good tyrants. The word was originally a neutral word. It's imported from that kingdom of Lydia, who also first invents coins in the Archaic Age. Know that there's that list of 12 things that change in the Archaic Age on the exam. Among them is hoplite warfare, the invention of coins, lyric poetry, the invention of the polis system, the city-state system that all the Greek cities essentially develop at the same time. There's 12 things, and you should know that list. You should know it well enough to recognize it. Then we go on to Periander of Corinth. He says, practice is everything. Cleobulus of Lindos says, excellence is in measurement. Or excellence is measured. It's hard to translate these things. They're 2 words each usually. And the point is that they're as quick and as pithy and as witty as you can get. They're not wasting words here. Excellence is measured. It might mean something like excellence is moderation, or excellence gets measured. You become the standard because you jumped the furthest, and now you're the measure for future people to try to measure up to. Chilon, the first and most famous, perhaps, ephor of the Spartans. He's probably as responsible for what Sparta becomes as the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus is. Lycurgus is important, but perhaps Chilon is the more real figure that makes Sparta into the nation that it becomes. Having trouble writing on the iPad. There we go, Lycurgus. He's about 885 BC, whereas Chilon is about 300 years later, more around the time of Solon. So Chilon says, borrow and ruin is near, or the specific word is ate, which is a goddess that comes to you, and it means kind of ruinous anger, losing your temper, flying off the handle, going nuts. Borrow and ate is near. And the Greeks accept this, that the goddess comes to you sometimes. You don't want it to happen. When it does, you apologize, and the other person should understand because ate comes to everybody once in a while. B.S. of Priene says the majority is evil. The masses are base. Most people are bad. And finally, Pittacus of Mylene says, know what is appropriate. Know at every moment what is the right thing to do. That is a broad, quick overview of some topics I think were perhaps obscured along the way or not emphasized enough. And in the course, I've also pointed you to some things that you should study, like the 12 things that changed during the Archaic Age. What brought them out of the Dark Age? It was the age of colonization. The art changed. There's 12 things that change. So along the way, I pointed to you some of those things that you should go back and restudy if you don't know them. And you should have read all those chapters by now, up into the midterm. Those will have provided you with the general information, the dates, terms, and figures that you need to know. This screencast is not meant to be a comprehensive review. It is just touching on some of the key points.